The quiet, pre-dawn light of a Tuesday morning in North Shore, Sydney, was thin and gray, filtering through the curtains with a stillness that had become the defining rhythm of my life since Evelyn passed away 3 years ago. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at the empty chair across from me when the front door opened. My son, Lachlan, had a key, but his wife, Sienna, had a habit of announcing herself with an aggressive, proprietary energy that made the floorboards groan. I did not move. I expected a mundane inquiry about the weekend, or perhaps a request for my old trailer, but the atmosphere in the room shifted the moment they stepped into the living room. They were not alone. Behind them walked a solicitor, a man whose posture was as stiff and formal as the leather portfolio he clutched to his chest. Sienna led the way, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood, her face wearing a mask of practiced, saccharine concern. Lachlan followed, his gaze fixed somewhere on the wall behind me, his shoulders hunched in a way that signaled he was merely the supporting actor in the performance Sienna was about to deliver. They didn't offer a morning greeting. They didn't ask if I'd slept well. Sienna simply gestured for the solicitor to sit, while she remained standing, an arrogant, impatient glint in her eyes. "Arthur," she began, her voice dripping with an artificial, rehearsed empathy, "Lachlan and I have been giving your living situation a great deal of thought. You are getting older, and this house, this massive, sprawling property, is simply becoming a liability. It is too much maintenance for one person. It is not safe." I looked up at her, keeping my face entirely blank, my pulse maintaining a steady, rhythmic cadence born from 40 years of navigating corporate volatility on construction sites. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence hang, forcing her to continue, to reveal the full scope of the blueprint she had drafted for my life. "We have found a wonderful, affordable facility just outside the city," she continued, her voice rising in a pitch of forced enthusiasm. "It is an aged care facility, with full-time staff and medical oversight. It is where you belong. But before we can secure your placement, we need to handle the logistics of your current assets. Lachlan and I are prepared to take the responsibility of selling this property off your hands. We will handle the sale, manage the capital, and ensure you are comfortable. All we need is for you to sign the transfer of title here." She nodded to the solicitor, who opened his portfolio and slid a thick, imposing document across the granite kitchen island. I looked at the gold-embossed pen she had placed beside it. I looked at the document, at the cold, clinical language designed to strip me of the home I had built with Evelyn. The home where we had raised Lachlan, the home that held the physical remnants of a lifetime of labor. My son, the boy I had stayed up late helping with homework, the boy whose education I had funded through back-breaking double shifts in the Sydney heat, stood there and didn't utter a single word of protest. He didn't look me in the eye. He was staring intensely at his phone, his silence a profound betrayal that weighed more heavily than the document itself. Sienna tapped her manicured fingernail against the paper, her impatience already beginning to fray the edges of her performance. She wasn't asking for my permission. She was signaling the start of an eviction. The structural integrity of my family had officially failed, and in that moment, I realized that the house wasn't just a property to them. It was an asset they were ready to dismantle. I didn't weep, and I didn't shout. I simply watched them, a master builder observing a structure that had been compromised from the inside out, and began to calculate exactly how much force I would need to bring their entire, greedy ambition crashing down. I set my coffee mug down on the granite island with a sound that felt like a gavel striking a bench. My hands, calloused and scarred from 4 decades of wrestling with heavy industrial machinery and negotiating multi-million-dollar commercial contracts, remained perfectly steady. I looked at the solicitor, then back at Sienna, whose smug, expectant smile was already beginning to tighten at the corners. They were treating me like a fading relic, a man whose mind was as brittle as the dry rot in a neglected foundation. They expected a protest, a moment of senile confusion, or perhaps a tearful appeal to the bond of blood. They were about to learn that a man who has spent his life diagnosing structural failures does not break when the load becomes too heavy. He simply calculates how to offload the weight. You speak of responsibility, Sienna, I said, my voice low and devoid of the tremor she was so desperate to provoke. But responsibility is a structural integrity issue. It is not something you claim. It is something you demonstrate through years of consistent action. Lachlan shifted his weight, his eyes finally flickering toward me before darting away, back to the safe, shallow screen of his phone. Dad, don't be difficult, he mumbled, his voice carrying that familiar, hollow petulance of a man who has spent his entire life being insulated from the consequences of his actions. We are trying to protect you. You are 70. The world is changing, and you are not equipped to keep up with the management of a property this size. I didn't answer him directly. I didn't remind him that I had managed complex, time-sensitive logistics for major infrastructure projects across New South Wales while he was still struggling to pass his introductory business units at university. Instead, I leaned back, my chair scraping slightly against the floor. I have dedicated my life to ensuring your stability, Lachlan, I said, keeping my tone clipped and professional. I have never asked for anything in return, save for the basic respect of a mutual partnership. If you believe this transition is necessary, I need time to consult with my own legal counsel. I do not sign documents of this magnitude without a comprehensive audit of the terms. Sienna's face flushed a momentary, ugly shade of crimson. Her mask slipped, revealing the sharp, acquisitive greed that fueled her entire existence. We are on a timeline, Arthur, she snapped, her voice losing its sugary veneer. The facility has a waiting list. We cannot wait for you to find some suburban solicitor. We'll just charge you by the hour to tell you what you already know. I stood up slowly, my movements methodical, and picked up the document. I didn't fold it. I didn't even read it. I simply held it between my thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of defective structural debris. You will have my decision by the end of the week, I stated, my voice echoing with an authority that caused the solicitor to visibly straighten his tie. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in the sudden, heavy silence of the house. I made my way to my study, locked the heavy oak door, and dialed the number of Jonathan Carter. It was time to pull the blueprints for a demolition they were entirely unprepared to survive. The sanctuary of my study was the only place in the house that still felt like it belonged to me. The walls were lined with technical manuals, original architectural blueprints from decades past, and the quiet, comforting weight of history. I sat in the leather armchair that Evelyn had bought me when I first retired, the smell of aged paper and wood polish serving as a grounding influence as the phone rang. Jonathan Carter answered on the second ring. He was not merely an attorney. He was a master of estate preservation, a man who viewed the law not as a set of rules, but as an intricate, impenetrable fortress. Arthur, Jonathan said, his voice a gravelly, professional baritone. I trust the events we discussed are moving forward. I looked out the window toward the garden, where the afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the lawn. They have made their move, Jonathan, I replied, my voice steady. They arrived this morning with a solicitor and a transfer of title. They want the North Shore property, and they have already scouted an aged care facility to house me while they liquidate everything I've worked for. There was a brief, sharp silence on the other end of the line, the sound of a strategist processing variables. Then the trap is officially set, Jonathan noted. You are aware, of course, that we must maintain the facade of your vulnerability. If they suspect you have retained counsel, they will abandon the North Shore property and focus their efforts on finding other vulnerabilities. We need them to believe they are the ones in total control. That is exactly why I called, I said. I pulled the drawer of my desk open and withdrew a heavy, manila envelope containing the original deeds and the trust instruments Evelyn had insisted we finalize before her passing. I need you to confirm the status of the Western Riverina Station. I need to be absolutely certain that the irrevocable trust is watertight. No loopholes, no exceptions. Arthur, Jonathan began, his tone shifting into that of a man describing an indestructible bank vault. The structure we established is a masterpiece of asset protection. The station in the Riverina is shielded by a multi-layered truss structure. It is not listed as your personal property, and it does not pass through probate. It is held entirely within the legal entity we created. Not even a court order would be able to pierce that veil without a long, drawn-out battle that Lachlan and Sienna would lose before they even stood before a judge. You are not just protected, you are invisible. I felt a cold, sharp sense of relief wash over me. For years, I had lived a life of deliberate modesty, driving my old Uda and wearing my flannel shirts, precisely because I knew the day might come when I needed to test the character of those closest to me. I had kept the station a secret, a crown jewel hidden in plain sight. And the conditions? I asked. Are the triggers still active? They are, Jonathan confirmed. The moment they commit to a legally binding action intended to defraud your estate, the protections activate. If they attempt to leverage your assets, any assets, for their own gain through fraudulent means, they aren't just losing access to the station. They're triggering an automatic legal response that will expose their actions to the regulatory authorities. They are playing a game of chess against a grandmaster, Arthur. They just don't know it yet. I hung up the phone and looked at the photograph of Evelyn on my desk. She had always been the visionary, the one who saw the rot in Lachlan's character long before I was willing to admit it. I wasn't just defending a house. I was defending the legacy she had fought to secure. The foundation of their demise was already poured. Now, I just had to wait for them to walk onto the site. The following 3 days were an exercise in meticulous performance. I moved through the house with a deliberate, shaky gait, ensuring that whenever Lachlan or Sienna were present, I projected the image of a man whose world was rapidly narrowing. I left my keys in obvious places, made a show of misplacing my spectacles, and kept the television volume at a strained, near-audible level. It was a humiliating charade, a necessary degradation to ensure the trap remained sprung. They watched me with a mix of impatience and predatory calculation, their conversations shifting from hushed whispers to open discussions about floor plans and market valuations the moment they thought I was out of earshot. I spent most of my time in the study with the door ajar, listening to the cadence of their lives as they began to treat my home as if it were already a foreclosure sale. Sienna, in particular, was tireless. She walked through the rooms with a measuring tape, her voice echoing as she dictated to Lachlan the modifications she would make to the kitchen, the wall she would demolish to create an open-concept living area, and a specific high-end furnishing she intended to purchase with the proceeds. It was as if she were decorating a corpse. "It will be a clean $1 million in profit, at the very least," Sienna remarked one evening, her voice carrying clearly into the hallway. "If we move quickly, we can have the settlement finished before the next quarter. Arthur won't even notice the transition. He'll be settled into that facility, and the staff will manage his day-to-day. It's the most logical path for everyone." Lachlan's response was a murmur, but I caught the drift. He was concerned about the legal paperwork, the unpleasantness of the final signature. His hesitation wasn't rooted in morality. It was rooted in a coward's fear of the process. "We need him to sign the title transfer, Sienna. If he continues to be stubborn about consulting an attorney, it will drag on for months. We need to pressure him. Pressure him." Sienna's laugh was brittle and sharp. "He's an aging mechanic, Lachlan. He doesn't have the stomach for a fight. He's scared of the future, scared of being alone. We just need to convince him that his current life is a burden he can no longer carry. Keep mentioning the stairs, the medical bills, the upkeep. He'll fold." I stood in the dark of the study, the shadow of the doorframe hiding my presence. I felt no surge of anger, only a profound, crystalline clarity. They had spent 40 years benefiting from the stability I provided, never once considering the sacrifices required to maintain it. They saw my life as a series of accounts to be balanced and assets to be liquidated. They didn't see a father or a home. They saw a sunset, a closing act they were eager to hasten. As I walked back to my chair, I began to draft the next phase of the demolition. If they wanted to discuss the management of my assets, I would give them exactly what they were looking for, a masterclass in the value of what they were trying to steal. The opportunity arrived on a Friday, the the kind of quiet, overcast day that usually signaled the start of a long weekend. I had left the master bedroom door unlocked, leaving a file folder prominently displayed on the mahogany nightstand. Inside, I had placed an outdated medical power of attorney, a document drafted years ago during a routine hospital admission for a gallbladder issue. It was a perfectly legal piece of paper, though it was utterly redundant and had been superseded by my newer, comprehensive estate directives. To an untrained eye, however, it looked like a definitive key to my autonomy. I sat in the garden, meticulously pruning the hedges, watching from a distance as Sienna entered the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see her moving with a purposeful, frantic energy. A few minutes later, she exited the study. Her pace quickened, clutching the folder. She didn't head for the kitchen. She headed straight for the garage, where Lachlan was already waiting in their car. I put down the garden shears, my pulse as steady as a heartbeat, and waited. They didn't return for 4 hours. When they finally pulled into the driveway, they weren't alone. A man in a sharp, gray suit stepped out of their vehicle, a notary public I recognized from a local firm. They walked into the house with the confidence of people who had just secured the winning ticket. I waited until I heard them gathering in the dining room before I made my entrance, slumping my shoulders and slowing my gait until I looked the very image of the frail, overwhelmed man they had fabricated in their minds. "Arthur," Sienna said, her voice smooth and devoid of the impatience she had shown earlier. "We've taken the liberty of organizing your affairs. We spoke with a legal consultant, and they explained that this document is exactly what we need to simplify your life. It ensures that when you move to the facility, all the property management can be handled without you needing to worry about the paperwork." Lachlan sat at the head of the table, his eyes averted, his hands nervously fiddling with his wedding ring. He didn't look at me. He looked at the document, which had been modified. They had clearly spent the afternoon with that notary, not just reviewing the document, but actively altering the scope. They had transformed a limited medical proxy into a broad, sweeping, enduring power of attorney. It was a clumsy, desperate piece of legal theater. They had used an expensive pen to strike out specific lines, and a pen new, sweeping language that granted Lachlan full, unchecked authority over my real estate, bank accounts, and investment portfolios. "It's just a formality, Dad," Lachlan said, his voice straining to sound casual. "Sign here, and Sienna, and I will take care of everything. You could just focus on yourself." I stared at the paper. I could see the fresh ink, the slight smear where the notary had likely rushed the process. They were so blinded by the prospect of the $18 million station that they couldn't see the catastrophic risk they were running. They were committing a felony in my own dining room, under the watchful eye of a notary who clearly didn't mind a bit of side work. "This looks different," I whispered, putting on the performance of a confused, indecisive man. I let my hand shake, reaching out for the pen before pulling back. "I need to be sure. This is everything I have." "It's for your own good," Sienna snapped, the mask slipping just enough to show her teeth. "Sign it, Arthur. Don't make us involve the court." I took the pen, my fingers trembling in a perfectly rehearsed rhythm. I held the tip of the pen just millimeters above the signature line. They were holding their breath, their eyes wide and hungry, completely oblivious to the fact that by inducing me to sign this fraudulent document, they were not opening a vault. They were triggering the irreversible legal mechanisms Jonathan had set in motion. I hadn't just given them a document. I had handed them the rope they were currently tying around their own necks. I leaned down, the ink poised to strike, and felt the exhilarating coldness of a master builder watching the first support beam buckle under a calculated, insurmountable load. I signed the document with a deliberate, shaky hand, the ink flowing onto the page like the closing of a tomb. As I handed the pen back to the notary, I felt a singular, chilling sense of satisfaction. Lachlan's posture changed instantly. The tension that had been locked in his shoulders evaporated, replaced by a predatory relaxation. He didn't even look at me as he reached out to reclaim the folder. He looked at the paper as if it were a deed of absolute conquest, never suspecting that the document was, in fact, a carefully staged piece of evidence. "There," Sienna said, her voice bright, thin, and dangerously triumphant. That wasn't so difficult, was it? You've made the right decision, Arthur. You'll be much happier in a setting where you don't have to concern yourself with the heavy lifting. I retreated from the dining room without another word, maintaining my stooped, frail posture until I reached the safety of the study. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, I dropped the facade. I walked to the bay window, my back straight, my mind already operating with the cold precision of an engineer. I watched through the blinds as the trio, Lachlan, Sienna, and the notary, exited the house. They were walking toward their vehicle, their body language, shouting a victory they hadn't earned. Lachlan was laughing, a sound that carried clearly across the quiet driveway, while Sienna was already scrolling through her phone, no doubt checking the market listings for high-end properties in the eastern suburbs. I sat at my desk and pulled a small, innocuous-looking remote from beneath the blotter. I pressed a single button, activating the digital recording array I had installed weeks ago. Every word spoken in the dining room, every aggressive ultimatum delivered by Sienna, and every nervous, complicit murmur from Lachlan was now securely backed up on a cloud server managed by Jonathan Carter's firm. The notary was the weak link, and they had relied on him to legitimize a felony. By the time they reached the regional titles office on Monday morning to register the change of power, the document would be flagged. Jonathan had instructed me to ensure that the document was duly executed in the presence of a witness, and now that it was complete, the final trigger was primed. I knew their next move before they even considered it. They would attempt to secure a high-interest commercial loan against the Riverina station, believing they had bypassed the traditional, time-consuming banking protocols. They would use the forged enduring power of attorney as their collateral verification. They were like amateur builders attempting to construct a skyscraper on a swamp, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already drained the ground beneath them. I leaned back in my chair, the house feeling significantly lighter. The betrayal was no longer a personal affront. It had been codified into a criminal record. Lachlan had spent his life thinking he was entitled to a shortcut, a path of least resistance paved by my labor. He was about to discover that the most expensive path in life is the one built on fraud. I picked up my phone and sent a single, brief text to Jonathan. The document is executed. Proceed with the final stage of the audit. The response was instantaneous. Acknowledged. The snare is set. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the deep, resonant calm of a man who was no longer just protecting his home, but actively orchestrating the collapse of the deception that had poisoned his family. The weekend passed in a state of quiet, orchestrated tension. I remained in the house, maintaining the charade of the defeated, fading patriarch, while Lachlan and Sienna moved through the property with the brash, unearned confidence of new owners. They spent their time in the living room with the doors open, their voices carrying through the hallway as they finalized their strategy. They weren't just planning to sell the house. They were preparing to execute a leveraged buyout of the Riverina station, convinced that the forged power of attorney gave them the legal standing to bypass any oversight. They had contacted a private, predatory lender, a firm notorious for operating on the fringes of the commercial market, specializing in high-interest, rapid turnaround financing. These firms typically ignored the rigorous due diligence protocols of major banks in favor of aggressive, asset-backed lending. It was a perfect match for their desperation. I sat in the study, listening to their frantic, triumphant conversations, knowing precisely how this would play out. They were treating the Riverina station as a liquid asset, failing to realize that the moment they attempted to pledge that property as collateral, they would trigger a federal financial audit. On Monday morning, I watched from the garden as they left for the city in their luxury vehicle, the folder containing the forged document tucked securely under Lachlan's arm. They were headed to the regional titles office and then to the offices of the private lender. They believed they were driving toward their salvation. In reality, they were driving directly into the teeth of an inescapable legal trap. Once they departed, I met Jonathan Carter at a prearranged, neutral location, a quiet cafe in a neighboring suburb. He arrived with a briefcase that contained everything we needed to finalize the endgame. "The audit is underway, Arthur," Jonathan said, placing a tablet on the table between us. "The lender they contacted is already under scrutiny by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, for unconventional lending practices. When Lachlan and Sienna present that forged enduring power of attorney, the lender's internal compliance system, which we have already alerted, will flag the discrepancy between your original, ironclad trust instruments and the document they are attempting to use. They aren't just going to be denied the loan. They're going to be reported for attempted fraud." I looked at the screen, which displayed a real-time monitor of the legal filings. "And the station?" I asked. "The station is untouchable," Jonathan replied with a grim, thin smile. "The federal conservation easement is already registered against the deed. Even if they had a legitimate power of attorney, they could not subdivide or commercially develop that land. By attempting to pledge it as collateral, they are essentially trying to steal an asset that, by federal law, is locked in perpetuity. They are handing the authorities a roadmap to their own destruction." I felt the last vestige of paternal guilt dissolve into the cold, clean air of the morning. I had given my son every chance to be a man of character. I had offered him an education, a home, and the opportunity to build his own legacy. Instead, he had chosen to bet his entire existence on the gamble that I was too senile to notice him trying to steal my life's work. I finished my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the reality of the situation. "Let them believe they have won," I told Jonathan. "Let them walk into the lender's office, sign the final papers, and feel the thrill of that money hitting their account. I want them to reach for the prize before we close the cage." Jonathan nodded, his eyes sharpening. "The trap is fully primed, Arthur. By the time they realize the ground is shifting, it will be far too late to run." I left the cafe, feeling the weight of the last 40 years beginning to settle into a new, stable foundation. The demolition was no longer a plan. It was now an unavoidable, accelerating kinetic event. The final Tuesday morning arrived with a biting, coastal chill that seemed to mirror the encroaching frost in my own heart. I had decided that this would be my last day under the roof of the North Shore home. The house, which had been the silent witness to my greatest joys and my most profound grief, felt hollowed out by the events of the past week. Lachlan and Sienna were in high spirits, their voices echoing through the halls with an obnoxious, unearned vitality as they packed their belongings for a week-long getaway to the Gold Coast, intending to wait there while the funds from the Riverina station were processed. I stood in the center of the living room, my old canvas duffel bag resting at my feet. I had packed only the essentials, some flannel shirts, my tools, and a small box of photographs of Evelyn. I looked like a man who had been thoroughly defeated, a broken pensioner bowing out of his own life to satisfy the relentless demands of a younger, more ambitious generation. Sienna approached me, her face glowing with a toxic, condescending sympathy. "Arthur, don't look so glum," she said, resting a manicured hand on my shoulder, a touch that made my skin crawl with the realization of her superficiality. "This really is the best move for you. The facility is clean, the staff is attentive, and you won't have to worry about a thing. We've already cleared the primary living space, so the removalists will be here this afternoon to take the rest of your things." Lachlan didn't even look up from his phone, though he offered a brief, dismissive wave. "It's all handled, Dad. We've given the keys to the agent for the initial inspection. Just make sure you're ready for the transport car by noon." They truly believed they were the masters of this transition. They didn't see the bitterness in my resolve. They saw only the resignation of a man who had finally accepted his place in their shadow. I nodded slowly, deliberately maintaining the appearance of a man who had lost his spirit. "I understand," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and cracked. "I'll be ready." As I stepped onto the front porch, the morning air bit at my face, but I did not shudder. I walked toward my old Uda, which was parked at the edge of the driveway, away from their gleaming, imported sedan. I loaded my duffel bag into the tray and climbed into the driver's seat. I did not look back at the house. I did not offer one last, sentimental glance at the garden where Evelyn and I had spent so many afternoons. The house was no longer my home. It was a crime scene, a site where the character of my own son had been irrevocably dismantled. I started the engine, the familiar mechanical rumble of the UDA, feeling like a grounding, comforting pulse. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw Sienna watching me from the front window, her silhouette framed by the glass, a triumphant specter in a house she had stolen. She didn't know that by the time she returned from her celebratory trip to the Gold Coast, she would be returning to a life that had completely evaporated. I didn't drive toward the aged care facility. I turned toward the city, my hands firm on the steering wheel, my posture straightened into the rigid, focused frame of the man I had been for 40 years. The demolition was complete. The inhabitants had been evicted, and the site was now ready for the final, catastrophic shockwave. I drove into the Sydney traffic, blending into the sea of commuters, a ghost disappearing into the city, leaving behind a legacy of debt and deception that would soon become the only inheritance they would ever receive. The transition into the midweek period felt like the calm before a storm that only I could see coming. While I checked into a modest, quiet hotel in the central business district, anonymity being my most valuable asset, Lachlan and Sienna were settling into a high-end resort on the Gold Coast. I monitored their activities through the digital trail I had meticulously enabled. Their spending was immediate and reckless. A flurry of notifications alerted me to massive transactions on the joint account they had newly activated with the predatory lender's initial disbursement. They were buying watches, booking first-class upgrades, and indulging in the lifestyle they had spent their entire lives coveting, entirely convinced that the $5 million infusion into their account was the first installment of their stolen empire. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded by their own arrogance. Every transaction they made was a brick added to the structure of the federal case against them. They believed the money was theirs to keep, failing to understand that the lender they had chosen was not a bank, but a syndicate that operated under the constant surveillance of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. By using a forged enduring power of attorney to pledge a conservation-protected asset, they hadn't just engaged in a private dispute. They had committed a sophisticated, multi-layered financial crime that fell under the jurisdiction of federal investigators. I sat in the hotel suite, watching the real-time data feed on my tablet. I saw the records of their luxury purchases, the champagne-soaked dinners, and the arrogant, unsolicited advice they were dispensing to their social media followers about strategic asset management. It was nauseating, but it was essential. I needed them to become completely financially exposed. I needed them to commit enough resources that their collapse would be absolute, leaving no margin for them to plead ignorance or claim it was all a simple administrative error. Late on Thursday evening, I received a secure notification from Jonathan Carter. The final piece of the audit has been completed. Arthur, his message read. The predatory lender has officially been served with an injunction to freeze all accounts associated with the Riverina Station lien. Furthermore, the authorities have matched the digital signatures on the forged document with the IP address of the device used to draft it, which, as expected, traces back to Lachlan's home network. We have them on identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The net is closed. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the glittering lights of Sydney. The city appeared so ordered, so rigid in its structure, yet I knew it was filled with people like Lachlan and Sienna, people who believed that rules were merely suggestions for the unimaginative. They thought they had outmaneuvered me, that they had successfully offloaded the burden of their aging father while securing their future. They didn't understand that by attempting to trade my legacy for their comfort, they had effectively signed their own social and financial death warrants. I felt no urge to celebrate, no desire to gloat over their impending ruin. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of finality. The labor of the last few months hadn't been about revenge. It had been about ensuring that the values of honesty and integrity, the very values Evelyn and I had lived by, were not completely erased by their shallow greed. I checked the time. It was barely 24 hours before the official intervention would begin. By this time tomorrow, the triumphant vacation on the Gold Coast will be a memory they would spend the rest of their lives trying to escape. I turned off the light, laid down in the dark, and for the first time in years, slept without the weight of a betrayed father's grief pressing down on my chest. The arrival at the station in the Riverina was not the triumphant spectacle Lachlan and Sienna had imagined. They had invited a group of prospective investors, men in tailored wool overcoats who looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rugged, sun-scorched outback. Sienna had spent the entire journey detailing her plans for a luxury tech resort, gesturing wildly at the blueprints spread across the dashboard of their rental vehicle. She spoke of clear-cutting ancient timber and pouring concrete over pastures that had remained untouched for generations. I was waiting for them on the veranda of the main station house, sitting in a heavy wooden chair, a mug of coffee in my hand. I watched as their convoy, a gleaming black SUV followed by a line of heavy-duty, earth-moving equipment, crunched to a halt in the driveway. The roar of the machinery died down, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. When Lachlan stepped out, his face was flushed with a mixture of nervous excitement and the sheer arrogance of a man who believed he was about to secure his fortune. He didn't look at me with the respect of a son. He looked at me with the impatient dismissal of a landlord observing a tenant who had overstayed his welcome. "Arthur," he called out, his voice thin in the vast, open air. "You shouldn't be here. We have everything scheduled for the site inspection. You need to pack your things and find transport back to the city." Before I could answer, the silhouette of Jonathan Carter emerged from the shadows of the veranda, his sharp, navy suit cutting a striking figure against the rustic timber. Beside him, stepping out from the shade of the machinery, were two officers from the state police, their presence instantly changing the temperature of the conversation. The investors began to retreat toward their vehicles, their portfolios clutched tightly to their chests. They were ruthless businessmen, but they were not criminals. They sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, heavy gravity of a legal trap snapping shut. Jonathan walked down the steps, his gait measured and lethal. He didn't raise his voice, yet every word he spoke carried the weight of a final judgment. He held a thick packet of documents, bound with a federal seal that shimmered in the harsh midday sun. "Mr. Penhaligon," Jonathan said, addressing Lachlan with a cold, formal distance, "I am here to inform you that your claim to this property is nullified. This estate is registered under a federal conservation easement. It cannot be subdivided, developed, or pledged as collateral for any commercial enterprise. Any document suggesting otherwise, including the fraudulent power of attorney you presented to your lenders, is not just legally void. It is the primary evidence in a federal investigation into wire fraud and identity theft." The color drained from Lachlan's face so rapidly he looked as if he might collapse into the dust. Sienna stepped forward, her hand moving instinctively toward her bag, but she stopped when she saw the police officers moving closer. The arrogance that had fueled her for weeks was being replaced by a frantic, clawing realization of her own vulnerability. The dream of the luxury resort wasn't just stalling. It was being erased in real time, leaving them exposed in the middle of a desert they had tried to steal. The transformation in Lachlan's expression was instantaneous, a visceral collapse from arrogant entitlement to the wide-eyed, frantic realization of a cornered animal. He looked toward the rental car, perhaps hoping for a miracle or a path of retreat, but the deputies had already moved to block the driveway. Sienna, her face drained of all color, let out a high-pitched, incredulous laugh, a sharp, jagged sound that quickly withered under the crushing weight of the silence. She reached into her bag, her fingers fumbling with a stack of papers, and held them out as if they were a shield. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, her voice cracking against the vast, empty expanse of the outback. "We have the documentation. We have a signed power of attorney. You cannot just do this." Jonathan Carter didn't even flinch. He walked right up to them, his movements deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "The document you hold," he said, his voice cold and clinical, "is a forgery. We have the original audio recordings from your dining room. the testimony of the notary you bribed, who, I should add, is currently in custody and cooperating fully, and a complete digital audit of your home network. You did not just make a mistake, you committed a felony. The news hit them like a physical blow. Lachlan doubled over, clutching his stomach as if the very air had been sucked out of his lungs. He was no longer the sharp, successful broker he had pretended to be. He was a terrified, bankrupt man who had traded his future for a lie. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but the words died in his throat. Beside him, the investors had already disappeared into their vehicles, tires spinning frantically on the gravel as they abandoned the scene, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive stench of the fraud. The state police moved forward, the metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing sharply across the veranda. It was the definitive, final sound of a scheme colliding with reality. As the officers tightened the cuffs around Lachlan's wrists, he began to sob, a ragged, pathetic sound that lacked even a flicker of dignity. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a fatherly intervention that he had long ago rendered impossible. "Dad, please," he whimpered, his voice a thin, hysterical rasp. "They told us. They said it was all legal. Sienna said we could handle the debt. Please, just tell them it was a misunderstanding." I stood on the veranda, my hands tucked into my pockets, watching the destruction of the man he had chosen to become. I felt no urge to offer him comfort. There was no salvation to be found in the mud of his own making. "You didn't want a father, Lachlan," I said, my voice steady and devoid of mercy. "You want an asset. And now, you have the exact inheritance you deserve." Sienna, meanwhile, had descended into a state of pure, vitriolic fury. She was thrashing against the officers, spitting accusations at Lachlan, blaming him for the failure of the scheme, for the lack of foresight, for the very greed that she had meticulously nurtured. It was a chaotic, ugly display of a partnership built on convenience and deceit, finally shattering under the pressure of external accountability. As they were marched toward the patrol cruisers, their expensive, tailored clothing looked absurdly out of place against the harsh, unforgiving landscape. They had come to conquer a legacy, but they were leaving with nothing but the handcuffs on their wrists and a federal indictment hanging over their heads. I watched the patrol lights flicker against the darkening sky, the house finally beginning to feel like a sanctuary again. The dust from the patrol cruisers had long since settled into the parched earth of the Riverina, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a collective exhale of the land itself. Weeks had passed since the intervention, and the frantic, chaotic energy that Lachlan and Sienna had injected into my world had been completely scrubbed away. In the city, the legal process was moving with the slow, crushing inevitability of a glacier. The federal investigators had dismantled their lives piece by piece. The bank accounts they had artificially inflated were seized. Their luxury lifestyle was liquidated to satisfy the creditors they had defrauded, and the high-end apartment they had leased in Sydney was reclaimed by the landlord. They were now facing the stark, unvarnished reality of their own incompetence, navigating a system that did not care about their social standing or their perceived potential. I remained at the station, finding a sense of rhythm in the hard, honest work that Evelyn and I had cherished. The property was no longer a symbol of financial potential to be mined. It was a sanctuary, a living testament to the values of patience and persistence. Using a portion of the funds from the station's legitimate operations, I officially launched the Penhaligon Apprenticeship Initiative. It was a program designed to provide high-quality, hands-on mechanical training for young people from regional areas who, like me 40 years ago, had the aptitude for the trade but lacked the resources to break into the industry. We turned one of the larger machinery sheds into a dedicated workshop, filled with the tools of the trade, not for liquidation, but for creation. My life became quiet, punctuated only by the work of the day and the soft, evening calls from Jonathan Carter, who kept me updated on the steady progression of the criminal proceedings. Lachlan and Sienna were scheduled for trial, their defense attorneys struggling to find a narrative that could explain away the mountain of digital evidence I had provided. They were not just facing financial ruin, They were facing the very real prospect of significant time in a correctional facility. The people who had once laughed at the washed-up mechanic were now forced to listen to the judgment of the court, their world finally constrained by the boundaries of their own illegal choices. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of violet and burnt orange, I sat on the veranda, the same chair where I had watched their arrogant convoy arrive. I poured a glass of simple, red wine and looked toward the gate. I didn't feel a lingering sense of triumph, nor did I feel the hollow ache of regret. I had lost a son, but I had regained the stewardship of a legacy that belonged to something far greater than one family line. I walked into the house and stood before the silver-framed photograph of Evelyn on the mantel. The firelight flickered across her face, and for a moment, it felt as though she were standing right there with me, surveying the quiet, steady progress of the land. I had kept my promise. I had protected the home, the work, and the dignity of the life we had built. The demolition of the deception had been surgical, painful, and absolutely necessary. I picked up the mug of coffee I had poured earlier and walked to the door, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars were beginning to emerge, vast and indifferent, reminding me that the struggles of a single life or a single family were merely echoes in a much larger, enduring landscape. I was a master builder, not because I could construct walls, but because I knew how to distinguish between a foundation made of stone and one built on shifting, treacherous sand. My work here was done, and for the first time in a very long time, I was content to simply watch the stars and breathe in the stillness of a life that was finally, truly my own.